the death rattle of the modern institution. Why institutions cannot tell the truth, and the courageous can't afford not to. By Othniel Max Daves, November 16, 2025. Institutions are immortal. They tell us right up until the moment they trip over the truth. Land face first in their own paperwork, and blame the person who warned them about their staircase. Author's note. Every age inherits a particular curse. The belief that its institutions are wiser than the people who built them, more virtuous than the people who serve them, and more durable than the truth they claim to uphold. This article was written to dispel that delusion, not gently, not diplomatically, and certainly not with the soft hands of institutional self-esteem therapy. What follows is a blunt, unapologetic dissection of a reality most preferred to euphemize. If this reads as satire, it is only because the institutions of our time have become such exaggerated parodies of themselves that reporting their behavior with accuracy now feels indistinguishable from humor. One does not need to embellish a bureaucracy. One merely needs to describe it. The comedy writes itself, and the tragedy requires no creative intervention. This article is not a eulogy. Institutions do not deserve that kind of reverence. It is not a manifesto. The courageous do not require one. It is not an indictment designed to shock. The institutions indicted here have already self-implicated with more efficiency than any critic could dream of. What this article is, however, is a long overdue confrontation with a simple fact. The people who still possess a working conscience have become the last functioning adults in organizations that no longer remember what adulthood entails. The tone you will encounter, sharp, satirical, and at times uncomfortably honest, is not a stylistic choice, but a moral necessity. There is no polite vocabulary that adequately captures the spectacle of watching systems designed for justice, truth, competence, and stewardship transform into elaborate, bureaucratic stage plays where everyone pretends the show is still meaningful. The polite words were the problem. The brutal ones are the remedy. And so this author's note serves as a warning label for what follows. You will find no sentimental attachment to corrupted structures, no unearned nostalgia, no reverence for reputations built on institutional inertia, and no sympathy for committees that confuse caution with integrity. What you will find is a scalpel, sometimes a sword, and the steady hand required to hold them both. If this article unsettles, good. If it offends, better. And if it exposes, perfect. Because the institutions that fear truth the most deserve to meet it face to face. The institution, no longer alive. It is a solitary truth, seldom admitted and rarely applied. All institutions are inherently demonic. That is not metaphoric hyperbole, but the clean diagnosis laid down by Paul Tillich. When structures assume divine status, they invert their purpose and become agents of their own preservation. One need only observe the churches, corporations, governments, and NGOs of our day to understand that the diagnosis was not only timely, but inevitable. And here enters Reinhold Niebuhr with his cold sobriety. No institution can achieve the morality of the individual. Institutions, he observed, when confronted with their own mortality, will betray the very values they once vowed to uphold. They do so with an efficiency rivaled only by the decaying organism that devours its healthy cells in the desperate attempt to remain viable. In practice, this looks less like a dignified dissent and more like a clown opera of collapse. The boardroom convenes to reaffirm values, even as the mission statement is quietly replaced. The university issues a statement on academic freedom, even as it suspends the professor who pointed out the silence. The Church speaks of holiness even as the faithful are discouraged from dissent. Survival becomes the institution's highest virtue, and compliance the only sacrament. It is at this juncture that the courageous individual emerges as a paradoxical hero. Not the institution, not the board, not the bureaucracy. Only that man or woman who, in the face of death, institutional or otherwise, refuses to trade courage for comfort. As Niebuhr predicted, the moral altitude of a human being remains beyond the reach of any corporate charter, religious bylaw, or government policy. Meanwhile, the institution recoils, because when someone does not comply, when someone refuses to neutralize their conviction in exchange for organizational favors, they become dangerous. Their virtue unmasks the institution's fear. Their refusal to bend reveals the institution's broken spine. They are thus expelled, sidelined, excommunicated, precisely to protect the system. And so the institution persists, bland but sterile, alive only in form. Its bullet points remain current, its branding updated, its quarterly report optimistic. It remains alive in the sense of going through the motions, but dead to the purpose it once claimed. The paradox: institutions fear death more than they value life. They cling to life by sacrificing the living. But fear is a terrible architect. Under its direction, the institution does not erect pillars of justice. It constructs bunkers of denial. It does not nurture communities. It systems them. And it does not serve truth. It markets it. The purge of the courageous. There comes a moment in every decaying institution when the scent of truth becomes unbearable. This is usually around the time someone inside still believes that integrity matters. They haven't yet learned the organizational liturgy. We value ethics until ethics become expensive. Enter the courageous individual, the rare breed who has not surrendered their conscience for a pension plan. They speak plainly. They question quietly but truthfully. They refuse to pretend that the emperor's clothes merely need revision. They are the last remaining adults inside the crumbling edifice of denial. Nothing terrifies an institution more. Because the institution cannot allow a single upright man or woman to stand within its walls without forcing a comparison. The institution's survival now depends on a simple binary: purge the courageous, preserve the structure. The presence of one principled individual creates an intolerable tension, a living indictment that the organization lacks what it claims to possess. Thus begins the ritual purification. First comes the isolation. Invitations stop. Meetings forget to include them. And leadership suddenly develops selective amnesia about who was responsible for what. The courageous individual becomes a ghost long before they are exorcised. Second comes the smear. Subtle, sophisticated, professionally executed. They are no longer principled. They are rigid. They are not courageous. They are difficult. They are not loyal. They are misaligned with our evolving priorities. Every institution has its own polite synonyms for integrity. Then comes the final act, the exit. Always framed as mutual, always communicated as with deep gratitude, and always followed by a press release declaring that the organization remains fully committed to its values, the very values it just expelled. And with that, the institution congratulates itself, and it has eliminated the threat. It has neutralized the dissonance. It has ensured that its internal culture will remain undisturbed by the rare troublemaker who still believed in justice. But here lies the comedy and the tragedy. In purging the courageous, the institution amputates the very limb that could have saved it. The rot continues unchecked. The decay accelerates, and the structure becomes more fragile with every removal of a moral spine. By the time the institution realizes what it has done, it is too late. The courageous have found new ground, the cowards remain, and the institution, relieved to have silenced its conscience, drifts further toward irrelevance. Courage does not return once exiled. It finds new soil and grows elsewhere. The institution's death spiral is self-inflicted wound. Once the last courageous individual has been shown the door, escorted out politely, of course, in the manner befitting a heretic, the institution enters its final and most grotesque phase, the death spiral. This is the stage where the institution insists with increasing ferocity that it is thriving, precisely because every available metric indicates it is dying. The irony is exquisite. The first symptom of the death spiral is hyperactivity masquerading as purpose. Committees proliferate like mold spores in a flooded basement. Task forces are assembled with the solemnity of a war council, except no war is fought and no battle is won. The institution produces memos with the urgency of a collapsing civilization, all to avoid doing the one thing that could save it, telling the truth. Next comes the compulsive rewriting of the past. The courageous individuals who once carried the institution's moral weight are written out of its story. Their contributions are minimized, their warnings forgotten, their sacrifices erased. This historical laundering is not malicious. It is survival instinct. Institutions in decay must always pretend their collapse began long after the point where it actually did. Then comes the surge of managerial theater, where leaders begin performing leadership rather than exercising it. This usually includes 1. Announcing faux transformational initiatives that are neither transformative nor initiatives, they are slogans without heart-soul, cogency, or competence. 2. Commissioning rebranding exercises to disguise the absence of reform. 3. Strategizing about stakeholder engagement while ignoring every stakeholder who actually matters. 4. Scheduling all-hands meetings to reassure the staff that nothing is wrong, which is the universal corporate signal that everything is on fire. By this stage, the institution is, for all practical purposes, a hospice facility for its own reputation. The lights are on, the emails still flow, and the press releases still glow with manufactured optimism. But the interior has hollowed into a mausoleum of former convictions. What follows, predictably, is the rise of the cowardly executive class. Individuals whose primary skill is the careful avoidance of accountability. They are experts in the management of appearances, connoisseurs of plausible deniability, and high priests of bureaucratic self-preservation. Their one great fear is that someone, somewhere, might ask them to take responsibility for something. And so the institution spirals downward, buoyed only by the conviction that no one must ever admit how far it has fallen. A rational observer would conclude that the organization has crossed the threshold of irrelevance. The institution, however, interprets this as a branding challenge. The final absurdity emerges when the institution reaches critical failure but refuses to acknowledge it. Rather than accepting death with dignity, it insists on life support, even if that means cannibalizing its remaining departments, draining resources from the mission, and suffocating the last traces of vitality. It becomes a parody of itself, a bureaucratic zombie staggering toward a future it will never inhabit. And here is the punchline. Institutions do not die because their enemies defeat them. They die because their leaders cannot face the truth, and their courageous are no longer present to speak it. The death spiral is not a tragedy. It is the logical conclusion of cowardice. The exile and vindication of the courageous. Every institution believes it is punishing the courageous when it expels them. It imagines it is removing a problem, restoring harmony, stabilizing the system. In truth, it is unwittingly staging its own autopsy while sending the only living organ out the door. The courageous do not vanish into obscurity. They enter exile, a place institutions fear because they mistake it for death. But exile has historically been the workshop of every prophet, reformer, innovator, and truth-teller who ever mattered. Exile is simply the space outside the walls where reality is allowed to speak without interruption. For the courageous, exile is liberation. For the institution, it is loss. What institutions call falling out of alignment, history calls clarity. What institutions call insubordination, posterity calls integrity. What institutions call disruption, the future calls leadership. No institution has yet understood this, which is why institutions consistently destroy the only people capable of saving them. Once in exile, the courageous regain what the institution demanded they sacrifice: the ability to think freely, act honorably, and speak truth without navigating a political obstacle course designed by the timid. Their exile becomes a sanctuary for the very virtues the institutions pressed: conviction, vision, moral endurance, and the refusal to bow to fear. And here the great inversion occurs. Vindication arrives not because the courageous seek it, but because the institution inevitably collapses under the weight of the corruption it preferred over truth. When the institution finally buckles, as all institutions built on denial must, the courageous do not rejoice. They simply confirm what they warned. The institution that exiled them becomes the case study. Its decline becomes the textbook. Its failure becomes the sermon it never allowed to be preached from within. Vindication is not triumph, it is consequence. And the exiled courageous? They prosper, not always materially, but morally, spiritually, and intellectually. They build new frameworks. They form new communities. They construct alternatives that the old institutions lacked the courage to imagine. Their exile becomes the soil in which renewal germinates. Meanwhile, the institution, still convinced it punished a rebel, never realizes it exiled its last heartbeat. The courageous were not removed because they were dangerous. They were removed because they were necessary, and necessity terrifies the dying. The aftermath, when dead institutions keep walking. There is a particular horror unique to the modern world. The spectacle of institutions that have already died yet stubbornly refuse to acknowledge it. They do not collapse gracefully. They do not accept the dignity of an honest death. Instead, they linger, shambling relics of bureaucratic self-delusion, staggering forward on instinct alone, like a zombie with a strategic plan and a mission statement. These are institutions that have lost their integrity, forfeited their purpose, and expelled their courageous, yet insist that the problem lies with everyone else. They continue producing glossy reports, the way a corpse continues producing gases, involuntarily and to great discomfort. They continue convening meetings, launching initiatives, and issuing statements that sound suspiciously like the last panicked breaths of an organism that does not know it has expired. The tragedy is not their death. It is their refusal to die. In this afterlife, the institution no longer pursues meaning or mission. It pursues maintenance. Its animating goal becomes staying relevant just long enough to justify its budget. This is why zombie institutions obsess over branding. It is why they cling to titles, to ceremonies, to committees that exist purely to remind the public they exist. A dead institution still craves attention. It cannot generate substance, but it can attempt spectacle. hence the grand drama at the end of the age. In the aftermath, the leadership class becomes an even more interesting species. They insist, with the confidence of people who no longer believe what they're saying, that the institution is stronger than ever. They deliver morale-boosting speeches to rooms filled with employees who silently calculate how much longer they can survive without jumping ship. The leadership smiles, but their eyes bear the unmistakable glaze of people who know the building is burning, yet remain committed to discussing paint colors. What's left is institutional inertia, the slow grinding momentum of a structure too large to fall quickly, too empty to stand meaningfully, and too afraid to let the truth break through the drywall. Zombie institutions do not die because they are defeated. They die because they become irrelevant to the living. The world moves on. They do not. And here once again the courageous, the exiled, become the only ones who still matter. It is not that they are vindicated. It is that they are essential. They build what the dead institutions refuse to imagine. They create what the bureaucracy feared. They restore what the committees diluted. In exile, they have not only survived, they have outlived that which exiled them. The zombie institution, meanwhile, amasses another rebranding campaign, another strategic initiative, another glossy brochure, each more detached from reality than the last. It is no longer a participant in the world. It is an echo of what once was, a memorial to its own mistakes. Institutions do not know how to die. Only people do. And that is why individuals, never institutions, carry the future, when institutions forget how to die. So yes, Paul Tillich once warned that all institutions are inherently demonic, not in the Hollywood sense of spinning heads and levitating furniture, but in the more mundane and therefore far more dangerous sense. They misunderstand themselves as gods. Reinhold Niebuhr was blunter. He said no institution can ever reach the moral altitude of a single principled human being. And if you've ever observed an organization of any kind, church, corporation, government agency, NGO, or global philanthropic cartel, disguised as a humanitarian concern, you already know he was putting it politely. When confronted with collapse, institutions do not repent. They molt. They shed whatever skin they previously displayed as their mission and replace it with whatever new camouflage promises one more fiscal quarter of survival. The creed, disposable. The Constitution, amendable. The principles, negotiable. The ethics, only applicable to the little people. The institution itself, eternal, or so it imagines. This is why even the church, which was ordained to steward truth and confront power, so often behaves like a spooked raccoon caught in the rafters of a bureaucratic barn. Instead of confronting corruption, it hisses at the nearest threat to its brand identity. Instead of embodying courage, it produces position papers. Instead of prophetic truth, it issues press releases crafted by communications interns with degrees in sustainable messaging. These are the days when the smoke of the incense is indistinguishable from the smoke of the smoldering building. Tillich saw it early. Institutions, including the church, will consume the very people capable of saving them. Niebuhr, no sentimentalist himself, explained why. The moral courage that transforms history rests in individual men and women, not in structures. Institutions, when threatened, do not turn to these courageous ones. They exile them. The visionary is recast as the troublemaker. The truth-teller becomes the liability. The reformer is recategorized as not a team player. And once the institution completes this purification of conscience, the rot merely completes its natural work. We witness this everywhere. Bureaucracies sacrifice the brave to preserve the comfortable. Universities purge the intellectually honest to protect the ideologically fragile. Corporations discard ethical innovators in favor of financial necromancers skilled in rendering quarterly illusions. Political parties recoil from genuine statesmen to elevate the eternally re-electable, the chronically pliable, and the spiritually hollow. And churches? They perfect it. They canonize mediocrity, excommunicate integrity, and then stand at the gravesite of their credibility, wondering who committed the murder. To Tillich's demonic institutions and Niebuhr's morally inferior collectives, the individual of courage is radioactive. He stands as a living indictment of their cowardice. Her willingness to suffer for truth exposes their willingness to sell it retail. Their remedy is therefore predictable. Remove the courageous person, not the corruption. No priestly caste ever crucifies an institution. They crucify people. That is the way of things. And yet, as history has demonstrated with the reliability of gravity, these cleansed and purified institutions, having successfully rid themselves of their prophets, decay into irrelevance. They die as all hollow things die, loudly, defensively, and unaware that they are dead. They become museums of former conviction. They become temples to their own brand management. They become sanctuaries of nostalgic ritual with no living spirit to animate them. They continue to exist, technically the same way a corpse does, present, but not participating in the world of the living. Institutions forget one essential truth. They are not immortal. Only truth is, only integrity is, only courage is. And these belong to individuals, those unpurchased, unseduced, and unmanageable souls who would rather be expelled for righteousness than applauded for compromise. Tillich and Niebuhr had the clarity to state the uncomfortable fact. Institutions cannot save themselves. Their fear ensures they will push away the very individuals capable of redeeming them, and by doing so, they guarantee their obsolescence. The tragedy of our age is not that institutions are collapsing. It is that they deserve to. The hope of our age is not that institutions might suddenly ascend to moral greatness. They won't. It is that individuals still can, and often do, in spite of them. And it is always these exile ones, these inconvenient ones, these unmanageable moral radicals that history later calls by their true name, the last adults in the room who did not execute this childlikeness or trade it for the rotting, narcissistic shadow of it to please a completely desolate society. The birth of the parallel structures. Every collapsing age teaches the same lesson. Renewal never comes from the center. It comes from the margins, the exiles, the inconvenient ones who refuse to edit their conscience for compatibility with institutional fear. When the old order calcifies, the new order germinates outside its walls, and it always begins the same way, with parallel structures built by those the institution dismissed as expendable. Parallel structures are not created out of ambition. They are created out of necessity. They are the refuge for the honest, the competent, and the morally awake. The individuals the institution expelled because it could no longer tolerate the contrast. These structures arise not from grand strategy, but from the simple need to do things that the dead institution is no longer capable of doing without sabotaging itself. This is the moment where the courageous, once exiled, begin to construct an alternative ecosystem. They no longer petition the institution for reform. They bypass it entirely. They no longer ask for permission. They no longer need it. They no longer attempt to save the institution. They build what will replace it. Institutional leadership watches this with confusion. For decades, they assumed they were irreplaceable. They believed their relevance was permanent, their authority unquestioned, their importance woven into the fabric of society. And yet, as they ambled forward in their zombie condition, they turned to find that the living have quietly moved to another neighborhood. Parallel structures begin humbly, a small fellowship of competence, a gathering of principled individuals, a refusal to keep playing by rules written by cowards for the benefit of cowards. Over time, these become networks. Networks become communities. Communities become systems. And systems, if they are rooted in truth, courage, and competence, become the future. Meanwhile, the old institution continues producing press releases. The power of parallel structures lies in the fact that they are not infected by the institutional fear that doomed their predecessors. They are built by people who have already faced the consequences of telling the truth inside a corrupt system. Having already paid the cost, they can no longer be bribed, intimidated, or coerced by the failing order. They are immune to the institution's only real weapon, fear of exclusion. Once the courageous build something new, the dying institution insists these parallel structures are unserious, unstable, or dangerous. This is always the last gasp of an order that realizes it is being replaced by the very people it expelled. Institutions cannot imagine that the future belongs to people they once wrote off as misaligned or uncooperative. And yet here we are. Parallel structures endure because they are built on what institutions abandoned: truth, responsibility, competence, courage, and meaning. They do not need permission or legitimacy from decaying authorities. Their legitimacy is earned through actual integrity. Their authority rises from moral credibility. Their future is secured by the simple fact that they are alive, while the institution they left behind is not. This is the enduring irony of every age of collapse. The old order believes it is punishing the courageous. The new order forms around the courageous instead. In punishing the courageous, it actually proves them right, while exposing all of its wrongs. Oh, the great irony here. Institutions die, individuals endure, parallel structures inherit the future. The moment the center collapses, every failing institution eventually reaches the moment it has spent decades trying to avoid. The instant when all the scripts, incentives, illusions, and bureaucratic sleights of hand can no longer maintain the facade. This is the collapse of the center, the exact point where the institution discovers that relevance cannot be borrowed, credibility cannot be manufactured, and legitimacy cannot be faked. It always begins quietly. A critical system falters. A key decision fails. A scandal exposes a truth the institution can no longer bury under white papers and legal disclaimers. The leadership attempts a familiar remedy, messaging instead of reform, but the public, the employees, and reality itself have moved on. The applause sign no longer works. The audiences have left the theater. Then the cascade begins. Committees multiply not out of strategy but panic. Leaders demand reports to shield themselves from responsibility. Subordinates retreat into silence to avoid becoming the next scapegoat. Departments that once bragged about best practices now scramble to remember the last time they actually practiced anything besides self-preservation. The institution still insists it is stronger than ever, but the voice saying it cracks like an aging foundation under too much weight. At this point, the institution does not collapse because one part failed. It collapses because the center, the myth of cohesive purpose, finally disintegrates. The bureaucracy discovers that it is not a body, but a pile of disconnected limbs trying to remember how to walk. Policies contradict one another. Leaders contradict themselves. Everyone contradicts the truth. It is here, in this terrifying clarity, that the institution learns the one lesson it worked the hardest to avoid. Fear cannot hold anything together. Fear can silence people. Fear can suspend truth. Fear can punish the courageous. But fear cannot create coherence, integrity, or mission. And so the center falls. The collapse does not announce itself as drama. It is the drama. It arrives as recognition. No one believes in this anymore. Not the public. Not the workers. Not the leadership. Not even the institution itself. Once belief evaporates, inertia ends. The structure that once felt immovable becomes hollow. Decisions stop carrying authority, policies lose meaning, titles lose weight. The institution becomes a set of empty rooms filled with people performing rituals they no longer understand. And here stands the greatest irony of collapse. The courageous exiles, the ones purged for integrity, predicted this day not because they were prophets, but because they were sane. The center collapses precisely because it banished the only people who could have held it together. When the collapse comes, those exiles notice it, not with triumph, but with recognition. They do not need to cheer. Reality has done the work. The center has fallen because it was hollow, and the courageous have become the only living architecture left to build what comes next. When the parallel structures become the new order, there is a key moment in every civilizational transition when the truth becomes undeniable. The new order does not rise because the old order fell. The new order rises because the old order became irrelevant. By the time the institution finally collapses under the weight of its own cowardice, the parallel structures created by the courageous have already become the functioning architecture of reality. This transfer of legitimacy does not happen ceremonially. There is no grand announcement. No baton is passed. No declaration is issued. The transition occurs the same way dawn replaces night, slowly, quietly, inevitably. The moment the living begin solving the problems the dead could only study, power shifts without needing permission. People migrate first because people always move toward competence. Communities follow because people bring their loyalties with them. Resources follow next because resources follow trust. Authority follows last because authority always arrives late, long after the truth has already taken root. The parallel structures, once dismissed as fringe, rebellious, unorthodox, or not aligned with institutional priorities, become the only thing that works. They grow not because they are championed, but because they are necessary. They succeed because their founding principle is courage, not cowardice, responsibility, not avoidance, integrity, not image management. Meanwhile, the zombie institution still wanders in circles, unaware that it is no longer the center of anything. The brilliant irony is this: the new order does not overthrow the old. It simply renders it obsolete. Just as innovation outpaces bureaucracy, just as truth outlasts propaganda, just as courage eclipses fear, parallel structures simply outperform the institutions that once exiled them. This is how civilizations regenerate, not by salvaging the decrepit, but by building the living. The courageous do not intend to replace the old order. They are simply doing what needs to be done. They create because they cannot tolerate the vacuum left by institutional failure. They build because there is work that must exist after the rubble settles. They innovate because stagnation is not an option. And while the old institution fixates on appearances, messaging, and legacy preservation, the parallel structures quietly do its job better, more honestly, more effectively, more humanely. In time, even those who once believed in the old order begin to realize where real leadership now resides. By the time the old institution notices, the transition is complete. The new order is already operational. The old order is already irrelevant, and the courageous, once mocked, exiled, and ostracized, have become the architects of the future. The fallen order clings to its faded titles, credentials, its ceremonial committees, its hollow prestige, like a monarchy without subjects. But legitimacy has moved on, carried by those who refuse to compromise their integrity. The new order is alive. The old order is remembered only for why it failed. Why the courageous outlive every institution. The courageous outlive institutions for one simple reason. Institutions fear death, while the courageous fear only dishonor. Institutions cling to life the way a drowning man clings to driftwood, not because they have anything left worth preserving, but because they cannot imagine an existence without power, budget, or relevance. The courageous, on the other hand, are perfectly willing to lose everything except their integrity. This difference is decisive. Institutions preserve themselves by sacrificing truth. Courageous individuals preserve truth by sacrificing themselves. Only one of these strategies has ever built a future. The courageous outlive institutions because courage is renewable, and institutional fear is not. When institutions collapse, and they always collapse, they leave only paperwork, archives, and legal disclaimers. But the courageous leave something institutions cannot fabricate: moral precedent. They leave examples. They leave principles in motion. They leave living patterns for others to follow. Institutions deteriorate into warning signs. Courageous individuals become guideposts. This is why history remembers people, not structures. The institutions of every era proclaim themselves eternal, yet almost all of them eventually become chapters in the book of Philip. Meanwhile, the courageous, often ignored, often punished, often driven out, become the very voices that shape what comes next. The courageous outlive institutions because they act from conviction, not from compliance. Conviction creates momentum. Compliance creates stagnation. Institutions accumulate processes, committees, protocols, and layers of managerial insulation to protect themselves from risk, responsibility, and, ironically, the truth. Courageous individuals streamline everything down to a single orientation. Do what is right, even when it is costly. Institutions die of their own weight. Courageous individuals endure because they travel light. The courageous outlive institutions because they are not invested in the illusion of permanence. Institutions define themselves by longevity. How many years, how many charters, how many traditions, how many buildings. But the courageous define themselves by fidelity to truth, to conscience, to the long arc of justice that institutions always claim but rarely embody. What endures is not structure. What endures is character. The courageous outlive institutions because they refuse to become what the institution demands: docile, silent, manageable. They resist the transformation into organizational furniture. They refuse to become ornamental accessories in a system that has abandoned its founding purpose. In choosing exile, they choose life over slow institutional suffocation. And finally, the courageous outlive institutions because the institution's collapse vindicates them. Not because vindication was the goal, but because reality eventually aligns with truth. Institutions collapse precisely at the point where they can no longer silence the courageous reality testers they expelled. The courageous do not need monuments. The ruins of the institutions that rejected them are monument enough. In every age, the institution dies. In every age, the courageous continue forward. In every age, they carry what the institution abandoned. And in every age, they become the architecture of whatever rebirth follows. The cycle repeats until individuals break it. There is a terrible predictability to human history. Institutions always rot faster than the individuals who serve them, yet individuals continue offering themselves to institutions as if this time, this board, this pastor, this CEO, this administration, this committee, will finally prove the exception. They won't. The cycle repeats with the inevitability of gravity, and always for the same reason. Institutions are built to preserve themselves, while individuals are built to confront reality. The cycle begins with purpose. Every institution starts with vision, mission, conviction. Usually because one courageous individual had the audacity to act before a committee could redline the idea into impotence. That individual's fire ignites a movement. People gather, a structure forms, a culture takes shape. Then slowly, sometimes quickly, the structure becomes more important than the purpose. The mission becomes a brand. The calling becomes a slogan. The truth becomes a talking point. And the courageous founder is replaced by a bureaucracy of cautious successors who treat conviction as a liability and courage as a staffing risk. Thus begins the decline. The cycle accelerates when the institution chooses self-preservation over self-examination. It replaces repentance with public relations. It replaces accountability with messaging. It replaces leadership with management. It replaces moral clarity with consensus building, which is simply cowardice decorated with charts. Then comes the purge, because every decaying institution reaches a point where it cannot tolerate the scent of truth. The courageous are driven out. The compliant remain. The organization calcifies into the very thing it once opposed. Collapse follows as predictably as winter after autumn. And then, miraculously, the courageous rebuild what was lost, forming parallel structures, breathing life back into truths the institution abandoned. Renewal occurs not because the institution repented, but because individuals refuse to comply with its decay. This is the cycle: birth, purpose, bureaucracy, cowardice, decline, collapse, then rebirth, always outside the walls. This is how nations fall and rise, how religious movements stagnate and revive, how industries die and are reborn, how societies lose themselves and rediscover who they are. And the pattern will never break unless individuals decide to break it. This is the divine paradox. Institutions cannot reform themselves, but individuals can reject their corruption. Institutions cannot restore themselves, but individuals can rebuild what matters. Institutions cannot resurrect themselves, but individuals can resurrect a purpose. The cycle ends when enough courageous people refuse to surrender their conscience to an organization that long ago surrendered its own. The cycle ends when individuals stop confusing loyalty with silence. The cycle ends when truth becomes more precious than belonging, and integrity becomes more valuable than institutional approval. And when enough individuals make that choice, something extraordinary happens. The institution becomes irrelevant, the parallel structures become civilization, and the world that emerges is shaped not by dim-wit committees, but by those who refuse to be devoured by them. The cycle repeats until courage says no. The responsibility of the living in an age of institutional death. When the old order decays, when the institutions rot from within, when the committees lose their nerve, And when the bureaucracies forget how to tell the truth even to themselves, a new responsibility falls upon the living, not the credentialed, not the titled, not the self-anointed guardians of the collapsing status quo. The responsibility falls to the living, those who have not surrendered their conscience to the machinery of fear. In an age of institutional death, survival is not the challenge. Survival is almost guaranteed, because institutions always outlive their usefulness, but rarely outlast their illusions. The real challenge is responsibility, the duty to rebuild what the collapsing structures have abandoned. The living must do three things the dead institutions can no longer accomplish. First, they must tell the truth plainly, without fear or theatricality. Institutions lose the capacity for truth long before they collapse. They speak in euphemisms, disclaimers, and weaponized ambiguity. The living must break this linguistic spell. They must speak with the clarity the institution forfeited in its pursuit of self-preservation. Truth becomes the first act of reconstruction. Second, they must restore meaning where the institution introduced emptiness. Dead institutions specialize in hollow words. They issue statements devoid of conviction, strategies devoid of courage, and mission declarations that sound like they were written by risk-averse accountants. The living must restore depth to the concepts the institution drained: responsibility, honor, courage, justice, stewardship. The living must recover meaning from managerial decay. And third, they must build where the institution only performs. A dead institution does not create. It simulates creation. It generates initiatives instead of solutions, optics instead of outcomes, branding instead of substance. The living must build structures that actually function. Communities that foster moral seriousness, enterprises that pursue excellence, networks grounded in trust, systems that do not require a propaganda machine to remain upright. This responsibility is not glamorous. It is not adorned with titles, awards, or official recognition. The decaying institution will not bless the people who build what will replace it. It cannot. A dying order does not consecrate its successors. It resents them. And yet the responsibility remains. The living must build the world the dead institutions failed to preserve. The responsibility of the living is not nostalgia for what was. It is stewardship of what must be. The living cannot wait for permission from entities that no longer possess moral authority. They cannot ask permission from hierarchies that have lost their legitimacy. They cannot rely on systems that have forgotten their founding vision. The responsibility is personal, communal, and civilizational, taken up by those still capable of moral courage, not those who merely occupy institutional offices. In an age of institutional death, the living are called to something far more serious than reform. They are called to replacement, not as revolutionaries, but as stewards, not as rebels for rebellion's sake, but as custodians of the future, not as enemies of the old order, but as guardians of what the old order abandoned. The responsibility of the living is simply this: to refuse to let cowardice become the architecture of the next age. Why institutional collapse is not a crisis, but a clarification. When an institution collapses, the headlines call it a crisis. Analysts call it a shock. Commentators call it an emergency. But collapse is none of these things. Collapse is simply the moment reality becomes visible again. When an institution falls apart, it does not create chaos. It reveals the chaos that was already there, carefully disguised under decades of slogans, committees, and values statements crafted by lawyers posing as moral philosophers. Institutional collapse is not the end of order. It is the end of the illusion that the institution was the order. Collapse clarifies. It strips away the pretensions. It exposes the cowardice. It reveals the bureaucratic inertia and moral flatlining that the institution had spent years trying to hide behind leadership seminars and inspirational posters. People are shocked not because the institution fell, but because they now realize it never stood on anything solid in the first place. Collapse clarifies the true nature of leadership. Those who held their position through fear lose their audience. Those who held their influence through conformity lose their followers. Those who held authority through branding lose their masks. Meanwhile, the courageous, long exiled, dismissed, or quietly sabotaged, suddenly appear not as outliers or rebels, but as the only sane participants in the entire drama. Collapse vindicates the real and exposes the counterfeit. It is the moment the emperor's nudity becomes undeniable to everyone except the emperor. Collapse clarifies the cultural condition. It shows who was awake and who was hypnotized, who was principled and who was purchased, who was building and who was performing the choreography of competence. Institutional collapse is not the end of stability. It is the end of the stability that was never real. It is the moment the world is forced to reckon with what the courageous had already seen. It is not crisis. It is exposure. It is truth. It is the return of moral gravity. And once gravity returns, everything falls. When the courageous become the foundation of what comes next, institutions die for the same reason civilizations falter and empires crumble. They forget the moral architecture that once made them vital. They exchange conviction for convenience, courage for consensus, responsibility for optics. They begin to worship their own continuity rather than the truth they were meant to uphold. And once that exchange occurs, collapse is not a question of if but when, but collapse is not the end. It is the threshold. Because every age, every single one, finds its future not in the structures that crumble but in the individuals who refuse to. The courageous outlive the institutions that cast them out. They build parallel structures, carry forward meaning, and preserve the truths that the bureaucratic dead could not bear. They become the moral memory of a civilization and the architects of its renewal. Institutions fear death. Individuals fear dishonor. One produces collapse. The other produces rebirth. The task ahead belongs to the living, those still capable of integrity, competence, and courage. They will inherit what the institutions abandoned. They will reconstruct what the bureaucracies allowed to decay. They will carry forward what the timid found inconvenient. This responsibility is heavy, but it is also liberating, because it frees us from the illusion that institutional longevity equals institutional legitimacy. The world that emerges from institutional death is not shaped by the committees still clinging to their titles. It is shaped by the exiles, the people who refuse to conform to decay. These are the builders, the stewards, the adults in the room. They are not waiting for the old order to heal. They are constructing the next one. When the dust settles, history will record one simple truth. The institution died when it expelled its courageous. The future was born when the courageous walked out the door. And that door, once closed behind them, became the doorway into the next age. As for people, so too for the nation and nations,